Hi, it's Michael. I'm back with another session on the verbal side of the SAT. This is regarding the reading section. One of my friends on the SAT subreddit over at Reddit was looking for help on understanding the historical background behind some of these passages you may see on the reading section. It also occurs in the writing section, but not so much. Um, just to be clear, you don't need to know the history to answer the questions properly. The test is designed that all the answers are in the text. That's the point. But knowing something about the topic helps us get through it more quickly. It makes it more comprehensible. It makes the language easier to dissect and to decipher. And not knowing anything about the context of a historical passage makes that much more difficult. So while you can and should be able to process all the questions accurately, not knowing the history helps make it a lot easier. And also a matter of time because we waste a lot of time trying to figure it out, and we don't want to be pressed for time on this test. So I've developed a strategy here for applying a basic historical knowledge into the text in order to provide that context whenever you see a date on the passage. So I'm going to move to the tablet now and show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so what we're looking at is a document I've created a few years ago about historical timelines and themes for the SAT test. And this background knowledge, like I said, will help you develop context on any date you're going to get when you're taking the test. So let's say you see something that is 1874. The first thing I would do when I see a date like that, I would say, okay, what was the big war before and what was the big war after that? Because wars are where we have major historical change. Wars are the product of things going on in societies, between societies, and wars create new things and new situations that societies deal with. And this test is very, very consumed with a couple key themes here. And so I like to think always through what are we going to be getting on this reading section and the writing section as well. We're going to get a lot on global warming, on the climate, environmental sustainability, typical. We're going to get on the historical and the fiction, we're going to get a lot about social and political change. And that's in the historical pieces because they're obsessed with social transitions. And that, such as from aristocratic or elitist to modern and more democratic societies. And that includes a rise of the middle or professional classes. Frequently, we'll see that type of mid 1800s or early 20th century, where it's about class conflict and transitions between them. That's democratization, equality between the races, between the sexes, and then also impacts of industrialization, urbanization, and other types of things. The other things will show up on the physical sciences, social media, a lot on that, a lot on libraries and information technology. But for the historical side, there's a focus on political and social change, and that's what they go after on this test. So by thinking through the big wars, we can see that social change. So let's say it's a piece on 1874. I go, okay, what came before that? Well, we got the Civil War, right? What came after that? We got the Spanish-American War. Now I need to apply what I know about these wars in order to make sense of 1874. Okay, Civil War was the end of slavery, sectional conflict. 1874, you may or may not know, was still within the what we call Reconstruction era, just about at the end of it now. So it could have something to do with that. That may not be the detail of knowledge you have in terms of your dates, but I do know that following the Civil War, there was a period of Reconstruction, and that fell apart after a half a generation of that being in the northern occupation of the South. I know it's before the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War is where the United States has expanded coast to coast and is now expanding overseas with military adventurism and taking up its own colonies. And so I got some change going on within that too. So whatever the context of this document or this event of 1874 is going to be fit in right in here. So let's go through the major themes on each of these major wars. So the American Revolution, and by the way, in all the practice tests, I don't see anything that's got a direct relationship to the American Revolution. They tend to be after the American Revolution. I don't know if the College Board will not give a document regarding the time period of the American Revolution, but I've not seen it on any of the practice tests. But in case they do, the American Revolution, of course, is related to events prior to it, which is stuff like the French Indian War, the Enlightenment impact on society, and of course the war itself and its impact upon American economic, social, and political change, which has changed drastically from what came before. Now, the French Revolution, I have seen on the practice test several of the passages regarding the French Revolution. And know this about the French Revolution, please, okay? Um, it begins as an era of reform. So there are a lot of motives for the revolution, the anti-monarchy movement and the anti-clerical movement of that. But there was a lot started out as, hey, let's make things better. Almost a very positive, almost a very hopeful change. And as that French Revolution gained speed, it turned radical and violent. So if you see a reading from 1791, that's in the general period or towards the end of the what we call the Estates General period, when reform, political, social, and economic reform was the real basis of the discussion. Some for, some against. Generally, you'll have things, those two perspectives. Okay, and then of course, anything after 1793 will be about the Reign of Terror leading up to Napoleon taking power. We probably won't see much on that there. I think everyone pretty much agrees that this was really a disaster that period of time. Any case, so War of 1812, so we have America getting its standing, the era of good feelings following that, American patriotism, the political unity, that type of thing, and then leading up to the Mexican-American War, which is important because you have division, the sectional divide between North and South, slave and free, with the new states coming in towards the West that threw out that balance of 1820, which was the Missouri Compromise that said one free state for every slave state, which kept the balance of power in the Senate on an equal footing between North and South. Now we have the sectionalism is moving westward, and we have a series of new states that are coming from the territory that the Americans seized from Mexico in this war of 1846 to 48. U.S. Civil War, of course, you have the impact of the sectional divide, and you have the freeing, excuse me, you have the ending of slavery, the freeing of the slaves and providing citizenship, and the franchise for the former slaves who are male and not for women. That impacts a lot. So if you have a suffrage text or a women being involved in politics type text that is before the Civil War, it's generally going to be closely associated with a lot of the other reform movements of that time, such as emancipation, because it was all seen as an application of these ideals of equality, and therefore women fighting for and speaking for their rights in society, that was automatically aligned with the rights of the slaves and the evils of slavery. After the war, however, it's going to be turned into, if it's a women's rights tract, it'll be one, blaming the men for screwing things up, and two, it'll be solely focused on the suffrage element, and will of course be detached from the emancipation movement. So we'll see a difference in attitude between a women's rights passage before and after the Civil War. Then we get the the Spanish-American War. That's American expansion into taking Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, and that's American imperialism. And then we get to World War I. Now, the key thing to remember about World War I is that in Europe, it's total social mobilization, and in the United States, got deeply involved in this war and mobilized society towards the end of World War I, and women get the right to vote following World War I in 1919. So this is a key turning point for women's rights here. Then we have World War II. You, of course, have the Depression period before them. This is a key turning point for the general civil rights, especially African-American civil rights movements that start after World War II, because this is massive social mobilization across American society, led to a leveling of society and the beginning of the end of segregation following the war, with the desegregation of the Army and other federal workplaces, then eventually to Brown v. Board of Education. So we think in terms of the civil rights movement as being different before and after World War II. Then, of course, the Vietnam War, you have youth movements around it. You have the Cold War, American kind of rah-rah-rah about these things. We're missing Korea in here as well, which I should probably add. Korea is 1950. That's a Cold War event. But we think in terms of what's the impact of the Vietnam War on that attitude is that it becomes much more cynical towards American anti-communism movements. And then into the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have that change into the 80s. And then, of course, we have in our current lifetimes, our current generations, the Afghan War and the Iraq War and the War on Terror, and the implications of those ongoing overseas adventures by the American military. So if you would just keep these dates in mind. So you look at this and you see a date, you go, okay, what's the war that was associated with it? I get what's going on during that time. Now, we can think in terms of the impact of wars overseas. So the Napoleonic Wars are deeply impactful of American politics. So between the Jeffersonians and the Adams factions in the early American Republic, the political divide was either pro-UK or pro-France in the Napoleonic Wars. The Jeffersonians were for France. So if you see a reading with someone with that perspective, we know that they're going to be pro the French Revolution. And if there's someone who's the more pro-British stance, we know that they're going to be against the ideals of the French Revolution. Russo-Japanese War, that's sort of the entrance of Japan industrialized society into overseas military adventurism, leading, of course, into the invasion of Manchuria in the 1930s. Russian Revolution, Mexican Revolution is going on. It's impacting a lot of things. The Korean War, and then the Gulf War here. Okay. This timeline I've got much more detailed. I'm looking at major themes for these periods. In case anything comes up, you can perhaps look through this and build your more detailed knowledge about each of these periods that we're going to divide up by the wars. Okay, so I hope this helps. I'll publish this document with the video here, and just before I go, we'll look at how we could apply this into a couple of passages. I'm not going to do it entirely. I don't want to do passages that you have not already worked on, because I don't want to give you clues that you wouldn't have developed on your own. So I would ask you to, before you apply this, learn those big dates, familiarize yourself with some of the details of them, and then see how that can enhance your prior knowledge as you take on a reading passage that has an historical element. But I'll take the practice tests 2 and 4, which were dropped by the College Board in their 2020 book. It was in the original 2018 book, and not a lot of students use practice tests 2 and 4. So I'm going to show you just real briefly how historical knowledge can enhance your understanding of those texts. So here's practice test 2. This is the fiction piece. It takes place in 1857. If you don't know who Charlotte Bronte is, then you wouldn't know where this takes place, or perhaps it is. You might be able to figure it out from some of the words, like Bigden Close is not a very American word. So I hope you can get Mrs. King's Lodgings, these types of things. Maybe you can come and recognize that this is Edward Crimsworth. This is very British. But in any case, 1857 is before the American Civil War. It's during industrialization. So we want to think in terms of what is the impact on the social change being represented in this passage. In this case, it's about a young professional as he's joining the professional class, and he's got a bit of not a conflict, but it describes his relationship with his employer. So that's really the historical knowledge you can bring into this one here. There's not too much that else we can do with it, but it's just good to know that this is the time period and this is what's going on. We're dealing with actually change in the workplace here. And that would be dealing with, in this case, in this story, a relationship between an apprentice and his teacher, which is why he calls him the professor, which was a common thing in the professional classes in Britain and in the US as well in the 1800s. Now we get into this passage here. It's the fourth one. This is from 1869, the Women's Suffrage Convention in Washington, D.C. A couple things to note if you have some historical background on it, even if you don't know who Elizabeth Cady Stanton is. We know it's suffrage, so you just need to know that word. It's the women's right to vote. It's 1869, so it's after the Civil War. Now, why would Stanton's attitude be different from before the Civil War? Well, because first of all, it's no longer the women's suffrage and emancipation. So this convention is no longer aligned with emancipation. And it's following the war, in which you have the Constitution being amended to right the wrongs and bring in the former slaves into society, but it's not getting the vote to women. So the 16th Amendment, this is after the 15th Amendment, in which black men are given the vote. And so we know immediately that this is going to be fairly confrontational in terms of her attitude towards the political cause. It's going to be more directly political than before. And so this helps us appreciate the attitude she has, and then helps us dissect the language. She's talking about record of blood, for example, all the things that men have done. She's talking about the Civil War, and she's blaming all that on men and all the problems. And she's saying that we need to bring in the essential element, which is women's presence in political society, because you men screwed things up, which is basically her attitude towards this. So just with that, see, the male element has had high carnival thus far. So she's saying you men screwed up. And again, we get this sense because this would not be the attitude if it was before the Civil War. It is after the Civil War. Hope that helps on this one. I'm not going to go into it any deeper, but let's look at practice test 4. This is the fiction piece. So it's written in 2011. It's a story about a fictional Swedish scientist setting out for the North Pole in 1897. There's not a lot to know. 1897 is just before the Spanish-American War. It's after the Civil War, but it's also during the industrial period in US and Europe. We're going to see that this involves a Swedish scientist, but it's the same idea. There's going to be a lot of excitement about technology, a lot of excitement about exploration of the final areas of the Earth to be explored, which is the North and South Pole. So that's pretty much the historical background we're going to get there. We're going to get, though, from the attitude of 1897, a lot about the machines, because they're really fascinated by what machines can do and the way we can send our voice across the radio or across telegraph lines, the way we can use electricity. So there's going to be a little bit of that here, and this is kind of expressing, well, you know, just another, you know, mathematical fiction, that type of thing. So it's very, very an era of attitude of just the wonder and the possibilities of technology. Now, there's not too much more we can get out of that other than sort of trying to make sense of that point of view. There is, however, here a historical piece. This is from 1790 and 1791. So we have a couple people. You may or may not know Thomas Paine. You may or may not know Edmund Burke. But we do know that we're going to be given a perspective on each of them, reflections on the revolution in France. So 1790, remember I said, is in that reform period of the French Revolution, and Thomas Paine's written in 1791, The Rights of Man. That's straight out of the language of the French Revolution. So we're going to pretty much assume here that Paine is going to be for the French Revolution, and Burke, because this is a comparison, Burke is going to be against it. So just knowing that this will be the British perspective, and the British perspective is maintaining the status quo, it's very conservative, don't break down the institutions, and Thomas Paine being more radical and in the pro-French view. Thomas Paine, originally from England, became an important American revolutionary, became fascinated with the French Revolution. So that should just help us break down that what's going to happen is Burke is going to argue against the radical change, and he's going to talk about, you know, use the language of the Enlightenment. Society is a contract. And then we're going to have subordinate contracts. So he's going to be building his argument around the idea that you can't just go in and totally and radically change things. You're going to run into problems. And that's pretty much the attitude he has. Just by knowing this is a 1791, and I got two perspectives on the French Revolution. One's going to be for, one's against. That's all I need to have in my quick read of this introduction, not even knowing who Burke is or Thomas Paine is, just getting a sense that, well, Paine's going to be for the French Revolution and for the reforms and for the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that type of thing. And then therefore Burke is going to be against it. Take that British perspective. Okay, there's not too much more here to dissect then, other than just really seeing, especially in these comparison passages, seeing those different takes on it. So Paine hears that every age and generation must be free to act for itself. So that is obviously for reform and for change. So we have one pro, one against change here, okay? So I hope that helps. I've got this document for you, but please, if you do anything, just memorize the dates of the major wars, and then you can think through and identify some context based upon them. You can use this document to really break down some more nuanced understanding of each of those periods, and that way you can pick up some of these things, like I said, about the test 2 and 4 historical situations. Hopefully this will help you bring that out. Remember, they're always going to be interested in what is social change, transitions, social, political, and economic are going to be the big things on these historical passages. And knowing what was at stake at that time helps us get through this a lot more efficiently and hopefully more accurately. So I hope that helps. Let me know any questions. I'm not going to model anything more because I don't want you to use my historical understanding on your own practice. You need to develop your historical understanding and then apply it into your own practice. But I did go through practice tests 2 and 4 so you can see a little background how that'll help build context. Good luck, guys.